To underline the relevance of lived human experience and honor what's perceived by witnesses and experiencers in the unfolding narrative around UAPs and contact with the other, this is Neon Galactic. I'm James Falk. Thanks for joining us. The countless narratives that now exist from experiencers across the world and through thousands of years may yet function as a kind of cipher for understanding the nature of being and of our apparent contact with other intelligences. To understand what they mean will require a new approach built on accepting that testimony and gleaning from those experiences the deeper meaning and symbolic values of each single interaction. The global interpretations can wait, but by corralling these stories, we can establish a vocabulary, a lexicon surrounding how interactions with UAP and NHI impact individual lives, and through them, the broader course of human development. We've become obsessed as a culture with refereeing reality. One kind of experience is allowed under our modern scientific paradigm, the kind that conforms to our expectations and pet theories, while another sort, long accepted by our predecessors, gets reflectively rejected because they challenge how we think about everything. Despite this rejection, they continue to be common across the world. Yet let's be real, to assemble a puzzle, you need all the pieces. Humanity has some very odd-shaped pieces. Unless we include those oddities, matriculate them into our thinking, and accommodate the inconvenient, the underlying image will never resolve in a way that makes holistic sense. As Rice University professor Jeffrey Kripal says, we need to keep everything on the table. Our guest today is a champion of such inclusivity. Dr. Kimberly Engels is a member of the Society for UAP Studies, an associate professor of philosophy at Molloy University, and past president of the North American Sartre Society. She is someone who believes in the value of what people experience and has taken the professional risk of publicly engaging with the UAP question. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
I'm excited to talk to you. I feel like I can learn a lot from your approach. I think we all can. But let's start with sort of a broad general question. Who are you and how did you get into the UAP subject?
So as you said, I am, associate professor of philosophy at Molloy University. In addition to being a member of the Society for UAP Studies, I'm also the research director at the John Mack Institute, and I'm a member of the Rice University Archives of the Impossible metadata research team that's, looking at the large archival study. But before I was doing all of that, I was a philosopher who studied existentialism and phenomenology, right? Which are fields that focus on taking the lived experience of human beings as front and center. And I encountered this new anomalous form of human experience, which I know is actually really not new, but it was new to me. In about 2020, during the pandemic, I first watched Jamie Foxx's The Phenomenon documentary, which is very good. And at the end of that, they talk about the Ariel school encounter, and you see Harvard psychiatrist John Mack interviewing the children. And I was very intrigued. I said, who is this, Harvard psychiatrist who is taking this so seriously? And so I started reading the work of John Mack, who actually really employed very much a phenomenological approach in his own work. And I was stunned and went through my own form of ontological shock when I realized that there was something here, that this was not something that could just be pushed to the side, dismissed, pathologized, explained away. These encounters were describing something real, but something that challenged the boundaries of reality as I had even previously understood them. But as I came to terms with this, I decided that, if I wanted to stay true to my own roots as a philosopher of lived experience, I could not ignore these types of experiences just because they didn't fit in with the conditions of possibility as I understood them. And I was also influenced by the work of Jeffrey Kripal, who you mentioned in the intro, and read more and more testimony from individuals reporting these experiences, saw the profound existential transformations that many of them were going through, and that really intrigued me as an existential philosopher to see, individuals who were, maybe materialist or atheist or followed a very traditional religious belief, and emerged from this contact experience with a whole different way of, a whole different set of metaphysical commitments, a whole different set of ethical commitments, and just a new understanding of their own subjectivity, to use a phenomenological term. And so I got to the point where it felt disingenuous for me to just, I was doing all this in secret and reading on my own and not talking about it publicly. And it came to the point that, if I was going to continue my work as a philosopher, I had to dive into those experiences that were most profound, were most puzzling, were most philosophically interesting, and that have the widest potential in terms of transforming our entire understanding of who we are and what we're doing here. And so it was at that point, about 2.5 years ago now, that I started getting involved with the Society for UAP Studies, the John Mack Institute, did some archival work at Rice, and started producing scholarship and becoming part of the public conversation on UAP, which I think right now has been centered a bit too much on, talking about the technological capabilities of the objects that are observed, and not quite enough on understanding this as a site of profound transformative experience for humanity.
Yeah.
So I'll pause there.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you. For our folks who may not be philosophically, loaded up in terms of their education, can you give us a background of what phenomenology is and how you think that applies to this question, especially that last bit that you talked about in terms of gauging the event by the impact it's having rather than whether or not it's real or, yeah.
Right. So phenomenology is rooted in the foundational work came from Edmund Husserl. And it started with Husserl, but then it was developed in other thinkers like Martin Heidegger, Jean-Paul Sartre, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and then there's more recent work as well. And what phenomenology is about is studying the structure of lived conscious experience. So Husserl argued that, we can try to mathematize reality and read it on instruments and know something about it in abstract ways, but that is not more real than what we experience in the first person. This first person perspective is really our only access point to the world, however limited, however inadequate it can be at times, however confusing. It's our gateway into making sense of the world, right? So Husserl wanted to take that starting point, and he said, hey, you can't separate the knower from the known, right? In the scientific method, there's this struggle for objectivity and this idea that you're going to completely remove the subjectivity of the researchers involved. And Husserl said, what? Sure, go through the scientific process, but it's an illusion to think that you've completely removed any traces of subjectivity, because it's not possible, because you're a subject. Exactly, right. You're an experience, right? So he says that has to be our starting point for knowledge. That has to be our starting point for exploring anything. So phenomenology starts there. It says it's going to look at how do things appear in our experience, right? So what comes in through the senses, what is presented as a physical object, but what also comes through other modalities, like a remembered object or an anticipated object. If I'm ruminating about an argument I had with somebody last week, they're present in my consciousness, even if they're not present in the room. So it goes beyond just the structure of physical experience. It's, what are the different layers of even, mental experience, or what Husserl called noesis. And an important starting point in this method is what he called parenthesizing or bracketing. And that's where you suspend judgment on the source, the metaphysical origin of exactly what the object is, and instead you're studying what appears. And I think that this step is really useful for UAP studies for a couple of reasons. Because UFO testimony or UAP testimony has been approached in this sense of either it's obviously ridiculous and false because somebody reporting that, they were abducted by a being and floated through a wall and taken up into a craft, or received telepathic communication. Obviously, those things aren't scientifically possible, so this whole thing is just nothing. But there's also another problem, or another challenge that has come from people who are very strong proponents of the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And that is to only look at experiences that would support the extraterrestrial hypothesis, right? And then shove everything else off to the side. And some aspects of UAP encounters really don't support the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Some of them do, some of them don't, right? And so there's also this problem of just ignoring experience if it doesn't fit with your chosen theory. So if you're like a UFO anti-realist and you think it's all bunk, well, then anything that doesn't conform to the norms of science, you're just going to throw out, and anything that suggests that these are non-human technology or non-human intelligence is going to be dismissed. And simultaneously, if they're looking through the extraterrestrial hypothesis, they're going to be, cherry picking experiences that fit that. And so what happens is that these experiences, which are really strange, which are really uncanny, which are really transformative, which are really ontologically challenging in a lot of ways, we never really get to the meat of exploring what people are actually reporting, both the initial encounter itself and all of these transformative things that they go through in the aftermath, because we're stuck on this question of, well, what are UAP? Are they piloted by aliens? Are they coming from the future? Are they interdimensional? And we feel like we have to answer that question before we can start exploring this experience. And when we start with bracketing, we just say, hey, we're going to suspend that question. We're not going to say that we have to answer that question. Now, maybe we can look at the data later of what people are experiencing and test out, which of these seems most likely. But methodologically, we're going to start by just leaving that question to the side. We don't need to know exactly what this is, but we want to look at how are people living it? How are they experiencing it? What's showing up in their conscious experience, both during the initial encounter and in their lives moving forward? And let's see if we can pull out thematic patterns from that. Let's see if we can learn something about the essential structure of how this is appearing and how this is affecting people, because that might give us important clues to this overall picture of what's going on here. I'll pause there.
Yeah, just following up on that, I mean, what do you hope, or what have you seen so far taking that approach with what you've encountered? And then also, where do you hope it might ultimately lead once, I mean, you talked about being a part of the AI project at Archives of the Impossible, and that's a place where there's a lot of encounter data that you can go through and maybe dissect for patterns and that sort of thing. But what would you hope to achieve taking this approach?
So we hope to achieve getting a robust understanding of, first of all, what kinds of entities are people reporting, seeing? How do they appear in lived experience? And not saying, oh, we're only going to focus on some of them, but really looking at all of them, because there's a diverse spectrum. There's, the humanoid, like traditional grays with the big black eyes, those show up a lot, but also mantis beings, insectoid-like beings show up a lot. Humanoid, like pretty human-looking figures are actually very common. Like maybe they look just like a human being, but maybe they have like bigger ears or bigger eyes. We do encounter some like reptilian looking beings. We encounter celestial beings. We encounter beings who, at least as the individual lived it, they think that it shapeshifted right in front of them, or it was presenting itself in a way that was not its true appearance. So we want to understand that, and get a sense of what kind of beings are people reporting. Also, what's the content of the communication? So the communication is almost always reported as telepathic. It just either is like a mind to mind, or they hear a voice in the mind, or sometimes see pictures in the mind. So what is being communicated? What kinds of things are these beings saying to people or showing to people? And, what kind of patterns are there? And we have surfaced some preliminary patterns. There's a lot of communication about the environment and the climatic disaster, a need to urgently change how we are interacting with the earth. A lot of imagery about, coming apocalyptic events, climatic events, things like that. So that's one pattern that we've surfaced already, and that's been kind of out there in the literature for a while. But there's also, there's patterns about talking about that humans are kind of in the midst of an evolutionary process, and not just like in terms of our biological evolution, but our consciousness evolution. That's another theme that is common in the communication. And then we want to look at also, how is it affecting the individual? So patterns that we've surfaced are, shifts from a specific spiritual tradition, or no spiritual tradition, to a more kind of universal spirituality that's rooted in, interconnectedness, kind of oneness of all things. We've surfaced really profound shifts in how people think about consciousness itself, right? A lot of individuals emerge from these experiences, and I can't give percentages now because we're just not at that point with the research, but it's a reoccurring pattern. Many emerge with an understanding of consciousness, first of all, as capable of so much more than we've given it credit for, like non-local perception, non-local communication, the ability of consciousness to separate from the body, which is often experienced through these encounters. But also, many are reporting that they really see that consciousness is kind of the foundational property of the universe rather than physical matter. Time distortions are huge throughout these experiences. Missing time, okay, like a gap in time that they don't remember, but also extended time where they have an experience that lasts, it feels like it's lasting like 2 or 3 days, and then they come back to physical reality and only an hour has passed. Or the opposite, they feel like the experience only lasted 15 minutes, and they come back into physical reality and it's like they're missing a whole day, or they're missing 12 hours or something like that. Also, precognitive events become very common. Synchronicities, things start, time just starts acting in ways that are just more malleable than the linear account of how we traditionally understand time. Many also report changes in their ethical values, shifting in terms of, being more altruistic, more compassion for all of humanity, expressing unconditional love, not just for human beings, but for non-human life as well. Many people expand their circle of moral patiency or moral considerability and start seeing, non-human animals as worthy of moral concern, plants as potentially conscious beings worthy of moral concern, the earth itself is worthy of moral concern. So those patterns are also surfaced in the value changes that people report in the aftermath. So, what do we hope to do with this? Or what do I hope to do with this? And what do we collectively hope to do is that the more that we surface these themes and these experiences, the more that we can understand that the UAP issue goes beyond just these abnormal or anomalous objects in the sky or in the water. Like that's one piece of it. But this piece of it over here is also really important, right?
Mm-hmm.
And even Vallée said this, Jacques Vallée, when he was studying these events, he says people are forever changed in the aftermath of these events. I mean, people also start reporting increased psychic abilities, that they're getting downloads of information, just an expanded sense of consciousness. If we can surface this and we can show that these are things that people are experiencing, even if we don't know exactly how it's possible, okay? Because just surfacing how people are describing it is not going to, doesn't get us to understanding like the nature of how it is occurring. But it helps us understand that whatever explanatory model we put forth for explaining UAP has to account for what people are experiencing in a meaningful way, right? And if we just stay on this path of, well, there are these technological objects in the sky and they're a threat to national security, and really just kind of focusing on that aspect of it, that's just like only looking at one slice, right? We've also got this really rich spectrum of experience over here that I think is equally important to understanding the UAP issue. And if we can surface this in a way that is rigorous, that is scholarly, that is analytical, but also ontologically open, right? Then I think that we can inform our collective understanding of UAP and honestly start to chip away at some of those filters of possibility that we all have, right?
Yeah.
Ingo Swann called them like reality boxes, and you mentioned it a little bit at the beginning. It's like you hear an experience and you're like, well, that doesn't fit in my reality box, or that doesn't fit in my condition of my filter of what's possible. So just throw it over there and I don't need to look at it because it doesn't fit in with, my ontological boundaries of what kinds of things exist or what kind of things can happen. And I think that we need to collectively start loosening those ontological boundaries. And this doesn't mean just, dropping all scholarly rigor or that just anything goes, but really examining these experiences in a meaningful and open-minded way, and starting to experiment with different models of reality and relationality that could help explain that. I'll pause.
That was fantastic. The phenomenon you talked about where people end up transformed after having gone through these experiences, to me, underlines the phenomenological reality of the experience. People are impacted and they're transformed by it. So, whatever else we can say, they are in a reality where that happened and had a huge effect on them. And that has to be, therefore, taken seriously because it's happening for thousands and thousands of people. There's something real going on here, even if it's not real in the sense that we typically think of it. I wonder, with this kind of approach, you mentioned Jacques Vallée. There are a number of phenomena that sort of border UAP kinds of experiences, whether it's encounters with fairies or ghosts or NDE experiences, and there are a lot of consequences that track across those different phenomena. Are we being too do we have too much tunnel vision if we're focusing only on UAP in this way, or should we try to include some of those other subjects to kind of see if they are related or of the same nature?
This is where phenomenology is actually really great, because if we just look at the phenomenological description, like take the miracle at Fatima, Jacques Vallée did a really good phenomenological analysis of this, and he says, this event was interpreted as a religious event, and yes, the being that was observed on the disc that came down was celestial in appearance and was interpreted as being the Blessed Virgin. He said, but she was riding on the same technology that we've been witnessing the UFO entities riding around on. And so when we look at it phenomenologically and we just say what appeared, you actually find really profound similarities between UFO encounters and what have been interpreted as religious experiences, what may have been interpreted as, I said, like fairy experiences. My friend Brenda Densler is looking at the jinn in Islamic culture and how those beings show similarities to the UFO entities. And so it's very possible that many different cultures, many different time periods have been encountering the same phenomena and just kind of describing it through their own cultural lens or their religious framework, kind of giving different names to it. And if we can surface just looking at the structure of these experiences, we may find that we've all been collectively interacting with the same or similar phenomena. So we're starting by looking at experiences that were interpreted as, UFO events or UAP events, but that's just our starting point. And if we can compare this phenomenological data with these other, experiences that were interpreted as religious, things that have been classified perhaps as religious miracles, things that have been in folklore studies or cultural, different cultural groups. For example, many Indigenous American tribes report contact with star people or sky people, very similar to these UFO entities that people are reporting. Artie Six Killer Clark's work on that is quite wonderful. Yeah. So by all means, we should not limit our inquiry to just looking at if the individual interpreted it as a UFO. We should certainly be, looking at some of these other anomalous forms of experience and pulling out patterns. Kenneth Ring did a really interesting comparative analysis of UFO abductions and near-death experiences, and how there were similarities in what people experience in a near-death experience. It wasn't identical, but it was similar in some ways, and what people go through in a UFO event. Because if we surface that, we might see that experiences that we've classified as disparate or different or having nothing to do with each other, even people who study cryptids, like Bigfoot or Sasquatch, like the things that Bigfoot is observed doing, disappearing in thin air, it's very similar to the things that UFO entities are observed as doing as well. So phenomena that have often been, seen as having nothing to do with each other, phenomenology helps us surface ways they may actually be more similar than we previously thought. So I absolutely think we have to expand this to other forms of anomalous experiences.
You mentioned Kenneth Ring, and it reminds me of Ray Hernandez's work in terms of all of these different kinds of phenomena, and he groups them together as contact modalities, positing that there's something other and that we're brushing up against it in all these different ways. I imagine that from a pure phenomenological approach, that's assuming that we're contacting something, and that's applying some sort of explanation that may be a bit premature, but I think it's done in an earnest way. You mentioned Artie Six Killer Clark and the Native American traditions that have star people in their history. I noticed that online you were teaching a course on philosophy from the so-called margins, including African, Native American, and Latin American systems. I'm interested in how you think their approaches to being in the world prepare them better or more for these kinds of experiences, and how does that match the Western worldview, if at all?
Yeah, so I'll focus specifically on Native American or Indigenous American, because their epistemologies are fundamentally rooted in experience. And obviously, the Indigenous people of, let's look at like North America, they're a diverse group, many different tribes. So I'm speaking in generalities here. But Indigenous knowledges, plural, are place-based, and they're rooted in the particular and indirect experience. Direct experience in the natural world, very careful, kind of all senses experiential learning. And so all senses includes the five senses, but also the intuition, right? The sixth sense that we're pretty cut off from in modern Western society. For Indigenous people, that's a regular part of life. And also they have a wider ontology in terms of their conception of personhood. Personhood is not something that is only attributed to human beings. Non-human animals, plants are all seen as having, spirits and personhood and some sort of intelligence. The universe as a whole is seen as having some form of intelligence. But let's look at like the work of Vine Deloria, who's a Sioux theologian and philosopher, and he talked about how for Indigenous American people, and the Sioux in particular, there were no anomalies, right? Because there weren't, for the category of anomaly to arise, you have to first posit universals. And their knowledge was understood to be particular, as specific to their tribal land and space, and as only applying to the entities within their tribal land and space and the relationships between them. And so there wasn't this idea that if you experience something that doesn't fit in with like this universal understanding of how the whole world works, that you must obviously be hallucinating, or this must obviously be made up, or this must obviously, they have a much wider filter of possibility, right? Their reality box is much bigger. And they report a diversity of experiences with advanced non-human intelligences, contact with the dead, contact with guides, contact with star people, contact with cryptids, what we would call cryptids. They're just a wider range of non-human entities are a regular part of their ontology or their understanding of the world. And they're also distinctly non-anthropocentric cultures. So modern Western culture is very anthropocentric, especially with this idea that human beings are kind of the highest known species, and that we're the only species with like autonomy and choice making. And Indigenous American cultures are not anthropocentric in that sense. They understand human beings as one species with intelligence and choice making, kind of embedded in a meaningful world of other intelligences. So seeing the UFO craft and seeing some type of non-human being, and they have different names for these beings, the entities associated with UFOs and in the different tribal groups, but it's not ontologically shocking in the way it is for someone who grew up in like me, who grew up in rural Iowa and had a very pretty narrow reality box in terms of what kind of things I thought could exist. Me coming face to face with a gray with big black eyes, that's going to rupture my entire world in the way that someone who is raised and their whole community has an orientation in their understanding of the life world, as Husserl would say, their orientation in the life world allows for a spectrum of advanced intelligences. That's not going to be ontologically shocking in the same way that it is to someone like me, right? So having that experiential based epistemology, right, where the lived experience, the direct experience of the natural world, and then as it's passed down, through the oral tradition as kind of the foundation of their ways of knowing, having that openness in their epistemology and that wider ontology in terms of that wider reality box that allows a much wider spectrum of beings of possibility, absolutely makes them much better prepared to engage these experiences without it being some kind of ontological threat and ontological shock. I'll pause.
I wonder, I mean, this question comes up a lot where, we as Western culture identify something from the past that doesn't come from our, cultural group, like we're talking about Native American, thinking and philosophy. is it realistic to hope that we can begin to adopt some of that, or is that like not appropriate culturally? I mean, how do you think about that? Is that a kind of an example we can follow for a framework that we could move into, or would that be cultural borrowing of a toxic sort? I mean, how do you see that?
So first of all, I mean, there's questions of learning from a culture and learning from their approaches that is not trying to say, okay, now I am, and first of all, an expert on your culture and your approaches, or now I am, qualified to participate in your ceremonies or to communicate with the beings that your group communicates with, because many of them only, these beings can only be communicated with in specific places with under specific conditions. So that is inappropriate cultural appropriation. And just saying, okay, we are going to adopt the exact position of like, the Hopis understanding of the star people, and that's going to be like our understanding. That is, I think, inappropriate. But that's different from learning from how they, first of all, gather knowledge, how they think about knowledge, how they think about these beings, how they relate to them, and keeping that in our inventory of hermeneutical resources for thinking about these things, right? So it's not about, okay, let's try to just adopt this, let's try to adopt the Islamic, understanding of jinn, and that's just going to be our cultural understanding. Well, how about we really learn the history of the jinn, how they experience the jinn and interact with them, and use that as a potential hermeneutical resource for thinking about these experiences. So a concept that is really important here is this idea of epistemic injustice. And epistemic injustice is where some individuals are not treated as credible and reliable knowers. And within, like the Western Academy and Western society, basically pre-scientific cultures or pre-scientific knowledges are really not seen as valid hermeneutical resources. Like you can learn about them, to just document it as an anthropologist would, but they're not, their way of understanding the world isn't really given any real explanatory weight. It's just something that you learn about, but, oh, we know better over here with the scientific method. This is how things really are. And I think that that's a form of hermeneutical injustice where we're not making full use of the hermeneutical resources available for interpreting what's going on. So, and I also think that we should start looking at, people who have had religious experiences and start drawing on some of that, those experiences well, and some of the language that they use and how that might inform a more holistic approach to understanding this. Because a lot of cultures over time have described something similar to what these UFO experiences are. And if we just ignore that and say we're going to leave it over here on the margins and we're only going to focus on these like Western methods of either, the strictly scientific method or some kind of, social psychology or something like that, all from within, a Eurocentric framework, then we're not making full use of the explanatory options, and we're not making full use of the experiential knowledge that various cultures have brought to the table. And so I forgot what the original question was, but it was about, appropriation. So my position is that we can and absolutely should engage and learn from various cultural groups, especially marginalized groups, and their experiences. Also, people who have been marginalized because they've been diagnosed as mentally ill. I think that's another group who we can be learning from in this experience, because maybe what's been pathologized and diagnosed is actually, a meaningful resource in terms of thinking about this phenomenon. So I think that we can and should draw on as many interpretive and hermeneutical possibilities as possible, while being respectful and not, overstepping and saying that we're going to now position ourselves as the experts on this group's experience, or that we're going to, adopt their very specific, cultural experiences as our own in an inappropriate way. I think we can do that in a way that's balanced.
Even, I was hoping you'd, sort of go into something for me. As a society or as a culture, we think in terms of linear progress. We think that we are the most advanced because we have the coolest gadgets and that sort of thing. But to my mind, I think that that's a bias just because we're within this system. Can you explain why, just because another culture had different technologies, that doesn't necessarily mean that their worldview was inferior. It's just a different way of looking at the world. And so there are no qualitative judgments that can really be made about it, right?
That we assume, I agree with what you said there. We assume that because European cultures were more technologically advanced, that means that they were more advanced on the whole, right? And that they were obviously superior in all of these other ways. We live in a technological age. We live in a scientific age. That's how we have been conditioned to measure progress and to think about things getting better as we get more technological. That may be an error. We're getting more technological. We're getting more removed from the earth. And as the beings are reporting to people in contact experiences, we're getting more removed from the earth and we're destroying our living conditions here. So the question is, what does it mean to be advanced, right? I mean, it's well known that Indigenous American people lived much more harmoniously with the land. They were very in tune with, the planting techniques, the animals that they were there, a very balanced, interconnected kinship system, where, of course, yes, they had to eat plants and animals, but they didn't over harvest, they didn't overfish, they didn't overhunt. They were very tuned in of how to maintain that balance in a way that would be sustainable over time. And they seem to, they certainly do, in my opinion, continue to have much better knowledge of that than what we've displayed in Western culture, where it's just like, well, the earth is, in Martin Heidegger's essay on technology, he talks about that technology is this attitude towards being, where we see the earth as something that we just extract from. And it's just like, well, how can we use technology to harvest from the earth, to just take things from the earth for, seeing it as something that serves us, right? And to me, that is a less advanced way of being in the world, because it's not sustainable over time, right? That is going to collapse. We can't keep living that way. We can't keep doing it that way. We're creating a world that's going to be uninhabitable for a lot of us if we continue down that path. So technology is inherently neither good nor bad, but Heidegger's point is that technology actually constitutes an attitude towards being in the world, and that's become like our measure of all things, right? So it's like, oh, these technological cultures are obviously more advanced. Well, looking at what's actually more sustainable and what's also, I think, a more holistic perspective of the universe that actually was able to better accommodate for experiences that we've deemed anomalous in Western society. That doesn't seem, quote unquote, primitive to me, or that doesn't seem less advanced. That seems more advanced. That seems like something that we could learn from, and that we should learn from, and that we should kind of rethink our frameworks for what constitutes an advanced or a civilized society.
Yeah. I mean, long-term survivability is the ultimate metric for measuring the success or, the brilliance of a culture, I think, and we have
Absolutely.
proven to maybe be on the wrong side of that question. An interesting thing that I read was that, let's see, let me find the question. Where'd it go? Okay, yeah, you wrote a column for the Society that was talking about an interview you conducted with Karen Austin. And she's someone I've been working with, a good friend of mine. And so she
Mine
actually
too.
mentioned you to me
Okay.
and said that I needed to get to know your work. So I have, and I thank her for that. But you had done an interview with her and you'd gotten flagged on YouTube about something she had said about abduction. I've had the same experience when I did a show that mentioned abduction. I got flagged as misinformation. And I've talked about a lot of things on the show, but that's the only time I got,
That's the only time you got
flagged.
flagged.
Yeah, so I
Yep.
thought that was bizarre. And I think it's interesting in this moment that we're in when there is this kind of ongoing war on, factuality, where it's like, your fact versus my fact, but certain things are, raise an alert whether or not you're being political. And so I wonder what your thoughts are on the fact that abduction was flagged as a term. And do you feel like that is still problematic? And then ultimately, what that says about where we're at in this cultural milieu around truth and yeah,
Yeah, so it was actually it was Meta, it was Facebook that flagged me,
meta.
and
Okay, sorry.
this was before they've stopped all their fact checking now, but this was obviously before that, and um, it was significant enough to me to write that column about it because of all of the information that is misinformation that is constantly spread around
Yeah.
on Meta and all kinds of platforms, YouTube all over.
Mhm.
And it was bizarre to me some of the things that get posted with no problem and no question. And yet, the interview that I did with Karin was a scholarly interview. We were talking about phenomenology. I was engaging, it was put out by a scholarly society, the Society for UAP Studies. I used the phenomenological method to engage her experience. And yet, because the topic was alien abduction, this got flagged as spreading false information, right? That's just a step too far. All these other conspiracy theories are fine, throw those out here, but this is obviously false.
Mm.
Um, and I do think it's problematic. I think that, first of all, who is making these determinations? Um, there was no transparent, when I tried to appeal it, there was really no transparent process of how they made that determination. But I think it also just speaks to that we have mocked and stigmatized the abduction issue so much in culture that it's just seen as default ridiculous, right? And obviously this person is spreading false information. I mean, and it's been in the media, South Park did an episode mocking it. It was SNL has done stuff mocking it. It's kind of a
Meme
cultural
now. Yeah.
trope now. You get the
Yeah.
anal probe and things like that. It's a joke. But anybody who's sincerely reporting this kind of experience, and I'm actually, writing a paper right now with my collaborator Elliot Hauser about this. It's just like reporting an experience like this is a default red flag for a credibility deficit. Like you are obviously, if you're telling a story like this, you are obviously deranged, you're obviously confused, you're obviously lying, you're obviously crazy, quote unquote, for reporting this type of experience. And I mean, part of that, our institutions and the media played a role in stigmatizing UFOs. And then when individuals started sincerely reporting these experiences, when Whitley Strieber sincerely reported, and then individuals were going to John Mack and Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs and sincerely reporting, it, it was made clear that we should laugh at these people, that this is not something that we should be taking seriously. And it really is a profound form of epistemic injustice. I've done interviews with experiencers, including abductees, like in a private confidential study. And, some of them have reported that the stigmatization that they received in the aftermath and the dismissal and the mockery was far more traumatic than the actual experience of being abducted. It's like this occurred, or at least they experienced it that way, and it was ontologically shocking and traumatic. And then, but the way that people reacted to them, and the way that they were called crazy, that several actually reported experiences of people pretending to believe them, and then either writing an article that portrayed them as crazy, or I had one experiencer who confided in a therapist, and she told him that she believed him. She was, he thought that he had found like a support. And then she, in her private notes, to the psychiatrist, wrote to the psychiatrist that he was having severe hallucinations and needed to be like medicated. I mean, and that kind of betrayal is, first of all, it should be, it should be grounds for malpractice, but it's also it's
Yeah,
deeply traumatic to the individuals involved.
yeah.
And so I think that, in this era where, yes, I understand we kind of live in almost a post-truth era in the ways that, you know uh
That's really the
that
question I was wrestling with was how do we have
yeah.
these conversations when that assault is also going on, and some people want to lump it all together as being a continuing part of that attack on reality, but it's not. I mean, they've coexisted, but they're not the same thing, and that's a problem, I think, right?
No, it is. And I mean, and I've had that challenge myself. Some people have accused me of promoting conspiracy theories, or, yeah,
Yeah,
that I'm not promoting critical thinking by putting this out here. And I think we need to push back on it very strongly. And
yeah,
that's part of why I'm trying to put material out there that is scholarly rigorous. Um, because I'm trying to show that, hey, these are credentialed people who believe in methodological rigor, who believe in critical thinking, who do believe in introducing some kind of standards for determining what is true. It's not just anything goes and everybody's opinion is true and stuff like that. um so there are standards that we're going to introduce, and this is a serious topic that we can approach in a serious and rigorous way, and we should be talking about it in rigorous and scholarly ways, to show that it's a serious topic, to show that it's not something that we should just lump onto the pile of, all of this other post-truth, all of the other conspiracy theories that um are out there and bouncing around, and the misinformation that is so common. So I think how we talk about it becomes important, but it becomes even more important that we do talk about it and we model talking about it in serious ways, so that when we are speaking about it, it's not this default assumption of, oh, she just mentioned alien abduction, so obviously she's a crazy, tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy theorist, and you can't trust anything that comes out of her mouth. So let's model talking about it in responsible ways. Let's use, phenomenology alongside other methodologies for exploring these experiences and trying to start making sense of them in responsible ways, so that we can, not get lumped in with these other forms of misinformation, and, you know, be willing to go there, but have this be seen as something that is okay to talk about. And I think that's a long process and perhaps an uphill battle, but I think the work is important and I think we have to keep doing it.
that's exactly the aim of my show, is to have these kinds of serious conversations and push back against that, that viewing of the whole topic. Part of the problem is the politics of the moment. Obviously, some of the champions of the UFO subject, especially on Capitol Hill, are actual champions of that post-truth moment, so that makes it even more of an issue. But highlighting the bipartisan
Absolutely.
interest of it, I think, helps, and having folks like yourself invested and doing real important scholarly work is probably ultimately what will help distinguish the two. We can hope. On that question, I mean, like, you are a scholar who's come out on this subject and has written papers and engaged with other scholars and doing important work. Do you find that there has been progress in that regard more broadly? Is it growing? And what is the value in that? You talked about that just now a little bit, but if you could expand on that a little bit more.
It is growing, right? There's a growing number of scientists interested. There's a growing number of philosophers who are interested. Um, and social scientists, people for anthropologists, people from different disciplines who are starting to take this seriously. And, some of the folks that I've started collaborating with in these spaces are wonderful, open-minded, very, rigorous in their approach, but also ontologically open. And I think that's exactly what we need to move this topic forward. Um, so it is better. It's not all the way. I've had people who just kind of academically ghosted me, just, stopped replying to my emails. I've been quietly, removed from leadership roles. I've been, journals that used to ask me to review for them all the time don't ask me to review for them anymore and stuff like that. And I somewhat anticipated that some of that would happen. And I was actually warned when I first was entering into the field, kind of becoming public about it. Someone said, "Are you sure you want to do this?" And they say, there's going to be repercussions. And you know what? At that point, you know what I said? Let the chips fall where they may. I'm sure. This is too important to not talk about it. But I think we're headed in the right direction. I think we're headed in the right direction. I think there's a growing number who are taking it seriously, and the more scholarship that we produce, the more that we make it clear that, hey, it's okay to publish on this, and we're publishing on it in rigorous ways, and we're talking about it in rigorous ways. We're being serious, we're being critical, we're not just saying anything goes. We're really trying to approach this in a way that's thoughtful, in a way that's serious, in a way that really surfaces the full implications of this. I think the more that we do that, the more people who are going to, become interested, or at least, become tolerant of it. And we can carve out, more and more spaces for speaking about this. I actually, at my own institution, I'll give Molloy University credit. They've at least so far been very supportive. They even asked me to present last year, some of my work. Every year they ask certain faculty to present to the whole university on their research, and they asked me. So, I've gotten pretty good institutional support so far. The broader field of academic philosophy, I think, is going to take a little bit more time to catch up. But I think that, they'll get there. And the more that, if disclosure keeps unfolding little by little, and when we produce, the work and the metadata project that we want to through Rice, and we have more and more credible studies, and just showing good academic work that's being done on this topic, I think that we can continue to make progress, and we can start collectively exploring the meaning and the possibilities here, because this is so rich. I can't do all of the work that needs to be done, and none of us who are working in the field right now can do all the work that needs to be done. We need all hands on deck here, because this is big and important, and we need folks like you having these conversations as well. It's a really big thing, and it's a really important thing, and I think the more that we model speaking about it in serious ways, the more progress we'll make.
Thank you for that. We can call this our final question. I'm interested in hearing what you think the value of this topic is for the human race as a whole.
That is a big one to end with. It's huge, right? Let's try to unpack it in just a couple different ways, but
Yeah.
we're dealing with, we have admissions now that this is technology and it's not human technology. All right. So that means somebody is making it who's not us. So all of these anthropocentric structures that we have built our world around are called into question fundamentally. Even the concept of anthropocentric sovereignty, this was a piece by Alexander Wendt that he wrote, I think, in 2008. He talked about how the stigma against studying the UFO is at least partially there because, our whole conception of the modern nation state relies on anthropocentric sovereignty, and that we're the only species with agency and choice making. And the UFO challenges that. Our whole social structures are called into question there. But as an existential philosopher, there's this bigger and even deeper existential question that's out there. It's when we are confronted with an unknown other. You said that at the very beginning, and that's what this is. We are being confronted with an unknown, intelligent, mysterious other that presents in really strange ways in our experience. So we're asking the question, who are you to them? And then we also have to ask the question, who are we in relation to you, right? And when I see the experiencers and the things that they report, they have a physical encounter, and then they also have an experience of being separated from their body, or they have a spontaneous recall of a past life event or something like that, or they have an experience that feels like space and time have collapsed and they're interacting with the source of all existence. Like that is something that comes up in experience or testimony. It's like, that's huge, right? It's like, what are they trying to say to us? Or what might be calling to us from outside our very narrow reality boxes? James Madden, if you're not familiar with him, you should be. He's
I am. I've had him
wonderful. Okay.
on the show a couple times.
Oh, you've had him on the show. Okay, yeah. So
Yeah,
in
yeah,
his
he's
final
fantastic.
chapter, the final chapter of his book, Unidentified Flying Hyperobject, he talks about how we have all kind of carved out these like caves of meaning, meaning like these kind of very narrow ways that our cognition and just our technologies have like created this little box, our umwelt, and that's kind of what we think reality is, and we kind of just naturally tune ourselves out from what might be calling us from outside those parameters. And I think the UAP and these experiencer events are calling to us from outside those narrow caves of what we think reality is. And it's telling us, hey, reality is so much more than you thought that it was. It's so much more than you've allowed it to be through our dominant epistemologies and ontologies. And you are so much more, we as human beings are so much more than what we've been told that we are, right? Or so much more than what the scientific method or scientific age allows us to be, right? This is getting to, the most fundamental questions of like, why are we here? Who are we? Who are they? What does it mean to relate to them? I mean, and Jeffrey Kripal has said, maybe the key message is that reality is all one. And they say that sometimes, right? The beings themselves, they actually just say, everything's one thing, and like, we're actually you. So, and I'm not saying that's the answer, but it prompts us to ask that question, right? What is reality itself? Who are we? Who are they? What does it mean to be human in a post-anthropocentric world? In a world where we've been confronted with the reality that we have been embedded all this time in a universe that has other advanced intelligent life in it. That is the biggest question that we have ever confronted as a species. And the existential implications of this are huge. But it also allows us to ask this question of who are we and who do we want to be? How do we want to show up now that we know that there's some kind of unknown other, some kind of intelligence that we're not sure who they are, where they come from? How do we want to show up as human beings? What kind of a species do we want to be? How do we want to relate to each other in light of this? Do we want to continue, relating to each other through violence and transactional relationships? Do we want to keep relating to the earth through exploitation? Or do we want to reconfigure an attitude towards being, or a way towards being, a way of relating that's more holistic, that's more grounded, that's more rooted in a sense of showing up as the best version of our species that we can? So I think it prompts us to ask all of those questions. And those are big philosophical questions that humanity has been struggling with for a long time. But when we're faced with this unknown other, we're faced with a question of how are we going to show up in relationship to them? And I think that is the question that, as an existential philosopher, as a phenomenologist, and as an ethicist, I have a background in ethics too, that's what interests me the most. It's like, who are we going to become in light of this understanding that we are not alone in the universe? I'll end it there.
It was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for articulating that so perfectly. Thank you.